Hi, my name is Ainsley. I'm 24, and let me tell you, life has been a whirlwind lately. This story isn't just about a holiday visit to the countryside. It's about secrets, emotions, and moments so intense they've been etched into my memory forever. This year, I decided to spend a week at my Aunt Diana's house, nestled deep in the idyllic countryside. It was supposed to be a relaxing escape from the city's chaos. Diana lives with her son, my cousin Ezra. Growing up, we were inseparable, but as life took its course, we drifted apart. I hadn't seen Ezra in years, and the memory I had of him as the playful, lanky boy from our childhood felt like a lifetime ago. When I arrived, the day was bathed in golden sunlight, the kind of light that makes everything feel dreamy. My Aunt Deanna greeted me with her usual warmth and enthusiasm, her smile as welcoming as ever. But my eyes caught Ezra on the porch, leaning casually against the railing. His look lingered, scanning me with an intensity that caught me off guard. This wasn't the cousin I remembered. Ezra had grown up. Broad shoulders, chiseled jaw, and a confidence that bordered on magnetic. His once boyish grin was replaced with something more mature, and his gaze, it wasn't the look of family affection. There was something else there, something that sent an unexpected shiver down my spine. I walked into the house, pretending not to notice, but the air was charged with an energy I couldn't shake. Diana, always thoughtful, had already prepared the guest room for me, apologizing that she'd be busy at the family store for most of my visit. That left Ezra and me alone for long stretches of time. After unpacking, I decided to make the most of the day's heat by heading to the pool. I chose a sleek black bikini that accentuated every curve, layering it with a sheer cover-up that offered more suggestion than modesty. When I stepped outside, Ezra was already there, lounging by the water, his attention buried in his phone. "Ezra!" I called out, my tone casual as I sauntered over. "Mind helping me with some sunscreen?" His eyes flicked up, widening slightly before he quickly masked his surprise. Sure," he said, setting his phone down. I handed him the bottle, turning my back to him. The first touch of his hands was hesitant, almost trembling, but as he worked the lotion into my skin, his movements grew firmer, bolder. Every stroke sent an electric current through me, and I couldn't help but lean into the sensation, letting the tension between us build. That evening, after dinner, I suggested we watch a movie. I chose a loose tank top and shorts that clung to my hips, just enough to hint at what lay beneath. We settled onto the couch, the space between us shrinking as the movie played on. I noticed Ezra stealing glances, his eyes lingering longer than they should. "Are you comfortable?" I asked, my voice light, but my question loaded. "Yeah," he replied, though his body language betrayed him. I shifted slightly, letting the strap of my tank top slide off my shoulder. His jaw tightened. The air was thick with unspoken words, and I decided to push the boundary further. "I've been feeling tense all day. Would you mind giving me a massage?" His hesitation was brief before he nodded. "Sure." Lying down on the floor, I positioned myself perfectly, my curves accentuated by the dim light of the room. Ezra's hands were unsure at first, but as he worked, his touch became more confident, more deliberate. The moment his fingers brushed the small of my back, a spark ignited. The massage grew more intimate, and before I knew it, I had pulled my tank top off entirely. Ezra froze, his breathing heavy as he took in the sight before him. "Ainsley," he murmured, his voice thick with desire and restraint. I looked over my shoulder, meeting his gaze. "Ezra," I whispered, "don't stop." That was all it took. He leaned forward, his lips finding mine in a kiss that was hesitant at first, but quickly deepened. fueled by months, maybe years of buried emotions. Every movement, every touch felt like a release of something we'd both been holding back. The couch, the floor, the very air around us felt charged as we gave in to the inevitable. Every barrier, every unspoken rule shattered in that moment. The days that followed were a blur of secret glances, stolen touches, and whispered promises. We were careful, always on edge, knowing how precarious our situation was. The thrill of secrecy only heightened the intensity of our connection. But as my time at Aunt Diana's drew to a close, the weight of reality settled in. This couldn't last. We both knew it. Yet, as I packed my bags, Ezra pulled me close one last time, his lips brushing against my ear. "Promise me this isn't the end," he whispered. I nodded, tears pricking my eyes. "It's not." As I drove away, the memories of those days lingered like a vivid dream, a dream that I wasn't sure I'd ever wake up from. The car ride back to my apartment was silent, save for the hum of the engine. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, the cool leather grounding me as my mind raced. I could still feel Ezra's touch, the weight of his presence lingering like an invisible tether, pulling me back to that house. I parked outside, staring blankly at my front door for what felt like an eternity. My apartment, once a sanctuary of solitude, now felt too quiet. I craved the noise of the countryside, the hum of cicadas, the rustle of leaves in the wind, and more than anything, the sound of Ezra's laughter. Days turned into weeks, and while the world around me moved forward, I remained stuck, replaying every stolen glance, every whispered promise. My phone buzzed intermittently with messages from Ezra. Some were light-hearted, masking the weight of unspoken words. Others were more direct, his longing bleeding through the screen. "I can't stop thinking about you. Do you feel it too? Or am I losing my mind?" The answer was simple. Yes, I felt it too. But how could I admit that? How could I reconcile the bond we shared with the world's judgment looming over us? I buried myself in work, trying to drown out the ache in my chest, but no amount of distraction could erase the memories. It was a rainy Tuesday when the invitation came, a message from Aunt Diana. "Come spend another weekend with us. The house feels empty without you." I stared at the text, my heart leaping and sinking all at once. Seeing Ezra again felt like opening a wound that hadn't fully healed, but the pull was irresistible. Against my better judgment, I packed a bag and replied, "I'd love to." When I arrived, the house felt the same, yet different. Aunt Diana greeted me with her usual warmth, her arms wrapping around me in a hug that smelled of lavender and freshly baked bread. Ezra was nowhere to be seen, but I could feel his presence like an unspoken promise hanging in the air. "He's out in the barn," Aunt Diana said, catching my subtle glance toward the empty porch. "Probably working on that old truck again." The barn. It had always been Ezra's sanctuary, a place where he tinkered with engines and lost himself in the hum of machinery. I hesitated, my feet rooted to the ground, but curiosity got the better of me. The scent of oil and sawdust greeted me as I pushed open the heavy barn doors. Ezra was hunched over the hood of his truck, his shirt discarded and his skin glistening with sweat. The sight of him stole the breath from my lungs. He looked up, startled at first, but his expression softened when he saw me. "Ainsley," he said, his voice low and warm. "I didn't think you'd come." "I wasn't sure I would," I admitted, stepping closer. The space between us felt like a chasm and a thread, both separating and binding us. He wiped his hands on a rag, his gaze never leaving mine. "You've been on my mind," he said, the words heavy with meaning. "And you've been on mine." I confessed, my voice barely above a whisper. The distance between us disappeared in an instant. He closed the gap, his hands cupping my face as his lips found mine. The kiss was urgent, unrestrained, as if we were making up for lost time. The barn walls seemed to close in, leaving only the two of us in a world that didn't care about rules or consequences. His hands roamed, his touch igniting every nerve ending as he pulled me closer. The cool metal of the truck pressed against my back, a stark contrast to the heat building between us. The air was thick with the scent of oil and sweat, mingling with the undeniable pull of desire. "Ainsley," he murmured, his voice raw with emotion, "I don't care what anyone thinks. I need you." His words shattered the last of my resolve. I let myself go, surrendering to the moment as his hands explored every inch of me, claiming me as his. The barn, once a place of solitude, became the backdrop for a connection so intense it felt like the world outside ceased to exist. But just as quickly as it began, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway brought us back to reality. Aunt Diana's voice called out from the house, her cheerful tone cutting through the haze. We pulled apart, breathless and flushed, the weight of what we'd done settling between us. "We can't keep doing this," I said, my voice trembling. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew they were a lie. The pull between us was too strong, too undeniable. Ezra nodded, his jaw tight. "I know, but that doesn't mean I'll stop wanting you." The rest of the weekend passed in a blur of stolen moments and heated glances. Every touch, every whisper, carried the weight of what we couldn't say aloud. We were playing a dangerous game, and the stakes were higher than ever. When I left that Sunday, my heart felt heavier than before. The barn encounter had deepened the bond between us, but it also made it clear that this couldn't continue. Yet, as I drove away, the memory of his touch lingered, a constant reminder that some connections are impossible to break. I drove away from the farmhouse with a knot of emotions tangled inside me. The weekend had only solidified what I already knew. My connection with Ezra was as undeniable as it was forbidden. The guilt pressed against my chest like a vice, but the memories of his touch, his voice, his longing gaze, those refused to fade. For weeks I tried to bury the feelings, to push them deep enough that they wouldn't surface, but Ezra's texts were unrelenting. Each message was a thread pulling me back into the web we had spun. "I can't stop thinking about you. You mean everything to me. Come back, Ainsley. Please." I knew I should have blocked his number, severed the tie, and moved on. But I didn't. Every message was a spark reigniting the fire I had tried to extinguish. I told myself I was done, and yet when he called late one night, his voice thick with something that sounded suspiciously like desperation, I answered. "Ainsley," he breathed, relief washing over his tone as soon as I picked up. "I need to see you." "Ezra, this has to stop," I whispered, my voice shaking with a mixture of resolve and longing. "We're playing with fire." "Then let it burn," he said, his words sending a shiver down my spine. "I can't let this go. I can't let you go." Against every ounce of logic, I agreed to meet him. We chose a secluded spot, an old abandoned barn on the outskirts of town that we used to explore as kids. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same place that held memories of innocent adventures would now bear witness to something far darker. When I arrived, Ezra was already there, leaning against his truck. The sight of him stole the air from my lungs. He looked conflicted, vulnerable, and yet so sure of himself, in a way that made my heart ache. "We can't keep doing this," I said as I approached, though my resolve faltered with every step closer to him. Then stop fighting it, he said, closing the distance between us. Tell me you don't feel it, Ainsley. Tell me, and I'll let you go. I couldn't. The words refused to come because they weren't true. Instead, I closed my eyes and felt the weight of his hand on mine, grounding me, pulling me in. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, the silence filled with unspoken words. But as his lips found mine, the dam broke. The kiss was charged, desperate, and filled with all the emotions we'd been holding back. The barn became a cocoon, shielding us from the reality that would inevitably crash down around us. This time, there was no hesitation. Every touch, every kiss was a declaration of something we could no longer deny. Ezra lifted me onto the truck bed, his hands exploring as if memorizing every inch of me. The rough fabric of his shirt against my skin was a sharp contrast to the softness of his lips. Time ceased to exist as we surrendered fully, the weight of our decisions evaporating in the heat of the moment. The morning after, reality came crashing down with brutal clarity. Aunt Diana's voice rang out through the farmhouse as she called for Ezra, her tone cheerful and oblivious. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my heart heavy with the knowledge of what we'd done. Ezra's hand found mine, his touch a quiet reassurance, but even he couldn't deny the storm brewing on the horizon. We decided to act normal, pretending nothing had happened. But the cracks in our facade began to show. Aunt Diana noticed the lingering glances, the way our conversations were charged with unspoken tension. She wasn't the only one. A neighbor caught Ezra's truck parked outside my apartment late one night. Whispers began to circulate, and soon the town was abuzz with rumors. It wasn't long before Aunt Diana confronted us. Her voice trembled with a mix of hurt and disbelief as she demanded answers. "Is it true?" she asked, her eyes filled with tears. "Tell me it's not true." I couldn't look at her. The shame was overwhelming. Ezra stepped forward, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I love her," he said simply, the weight of his confession hanging in the air. The fallout was swift and brutal. Aunt Diana's heartbreak was palpable, her anger cutting through the air like a knife. "You've destroyed this family," she said, her words laced with bitterness. Ezra and I left town shortly after, unable to face the judgment and whispers that followed us everywhere. We moved to a city where no one knew our names or our past, determined to start fresh. But the weight of what we'd done never fully lifted. Our relationship was built on a foundation of secrecy and betrayal, and it left scars that neither of us could ignore. Some days were filled with passion and a deep connection that felt unbreakable. Other days were heavy with guilt and regret, the enormity of our choices casting a shadow over everything. Years later, I look back and wonder if it was worth it. The love we shared was real, but it came at a cost I'm not sure either of us was prepared to pay. Sometimes, the lines we cross can't be uncrossed, and the price of forbidden love is far greater than we anticipate.